Catherine DeLong once envisioned becoming a foreign diplomat or maybe even a spy. But these days, she's more interested in helping landowners have what could be a very important conversation about their future. Hi, I'm Dave Price, and this is the American Farmland Owner Podcast. Catherine's previous 2 decades have largely been devoted to soil health and water quality, and she wants to help landowners prioritize those things too. However, it could mean learning how to talk about it with your land partners or your tenants, and that may not always be easy. We're going to get to what she's doing to help people have those conversations in a few minutes. But first, we have to explore this previous dream of becoming a spy. All right, Catherine, so you envisioned your life that you were going to go into international relations. So what was that supposed to be? Like, what were you picturing that you were going to be doing?
Sure. Well, like so many, I think Iowans, the thing I wanted most about where I wanted my life to go was to get out of Iowa.
Okay.
And so international relations sounded like something I could do to really, like, that wouldn't take me back to Iowa. And so I studied that, and I had wanted to have like a fabulous international lifestyle where I was like a diplomat or worked for the Foreign Service. Maybe I was a spy, something like that. And it was an interesting degree because I learned a lot about other countries and got to travel and things like that. But it's really like up in the air. It's really academic. And so when I finished school and came back to the US, I decided I wanted to do something a little bit more pragmatic. And so I had a bunch of odd jobs. I worked at a ski resort as a ski lift operator. I did AmeriCorps in the Southwest for half a year. I worked on a farm in California. And some of those were good experiences and some of those were okay experiences. But it really helped me understand that I did want some sort of career that I felt had some connection to the environment, something a little bit more tangible. And so the long story, the short version of this is that I ended up coming back to Iowa and getting a graduate degree in soil science. And that's how I kind of ended up working in water quality very happily back in Iowa.
Outstanding. Have you seen the show on Netflix called The Diplomat?
I haven't. With Carrie Russell?
Yes.
I haven't. Is it good?
I like it. I think I've seen the first 2 seasons, but it is it's a fascinating life. That could have been you.
I know. Yeah. I'll always have to live with that.
All right. So there was always some kind of connection to the soil. Is that from like growing up, or was that always in the back of your mind? I'm trying to picture how soil
Right.
and life of a spy connected.
Yeah, sure. No, not really any connection to soil growing up. I grew up in Des Moines, in, in a basically a more suburban environment.
Hmm.
And the connection came because after going to undergrad, when I came back and was doing all these outdoor projects, I read a couple books. I read Michael Pollan's Omnivore's Dilemma that talks about agriculture and what's good and what's bad. And so I just started to think more about, what is a tangible way for me to help the environment? And agriculture, obviously dominates our state. And so that seemed like a logical outlet. And so actually my goal was, after doing some of these odd jobs out in the Southwest, is that I wanted to go into science writing. I wanted to just help people understand how things work. And I applied to a couple different programs and I didn't get in. And then I was taking some classes at Iowa State because my undergraduate, I had like no classes in sciences. And so I was thinking of applying to graduate schools in the sciences. And then I met a professor at Iowa State who just happened to be a soil scientist.
Hmm.
And he had funding. And so I wasn't even necessarily thinking I would go into soil science. That never would have occurred to me. But it just was an opportunity. And You know, in Iowa, like going into soil science is a really strong connection to the environment, because anytime a raindrop falls in our state, like it's most likely to fall on soil. And so the soil has like a huge impact on all these things. But yeah, it wasn't my plan, but I'm really happy where it ended up.
As I always say here on the podcast, I didn't have the good experience of growing up in agriculture. I grew up close in Southern Illinois, not, we could drive not even 10 minutes from, not even 5 minutes really from our house, and we could see the cornfields there. But one of the most, I think, fascinating things about doing this podcast over the last year and a half is for farmland owners and operators, and even if you're an outside investor trying to figure it all out, you almost have to be a scientist, right? The knowledge you have to have of your soil to grow as much stuff as you can, as efficiently as you can. And I think some of the outsiders have a completely backwards view of how farmers view their land, in that just like anything, there's got to be some bad actors out there somewhere, but for the most part, like, you're gonna hose yourself if you don't take care of what you have. And so it's like almost everybody cares about their soil quality. And of course, you got to figure out the best way and what can you afford and all that kind of stuff. But it's fascinating what being a farmer entails.
Yeah, I know you have to be an expert in agronomy and economics and law. Like it's complicated, and it's getting more complicated too, about 40 years ago, most people had sort of sole ownership of farmland, and now we
Hmm.
have way more trusts. So the decision making around farmland is also getting more complicated. And also, like there are lots of straightforward um, economic arguments for, farming a certain way. But not necessarily the straight that, like something like soil health or taking care of the soil isn't necessarily, there's not a straightforward way that's acknowledged in like your yearly budget sheet, right? And so some of these things, it is harder to make time for them or to invest in them when they are sort of like long-term objectives.
So will you talk about your landowner education program,
Sure.
Iowa State Extension? So you have this every year,
Mhm.
and explain like what do you all try to accomplish?
Yeah. So your point about how like it's just getting more complicated, you have to be an expert on a lot of things. That's part of why we developed this program, is that, in Iowa, 58% of land is owned by someone who doesn't farm it. And so it's a really important group to think about giving them resources, helping them understand how to take care of their land. And so that's part of why we developed this program. And also, the complicated issues around ownership. So a lot of the people, so we've done this program for 1 year, and a lot of the folks who were in the program, I would say, are conservationists. They're people who already care a lot about conservation, but what they needed help with was getting across the finish line. So, I believe in something like cover crops, but how do I talk to my tenant about that? How do I
Hmm.
talk to my brother, my co-owner about that? When he may not necessarily be interested in conservation. What are the resources I need to give these folks? Should I include this in my lease? These are all like really complicated questions. And so I think people just need help walking through that. That's one of the goals of the program. We do that through lots of experts who we have talked to them, but we also have a cohort model so that they're not on their own. They're with a small group of other landowners who are wading through the same decisions. And so, we give them a lot of resources for the couple of weeks that we're together, but then they have this connection with other landowners across the state that they can maintain, I mean, hopefully for the rest of their lives as things come up. But the main goal of the program is to help landowners accomplish what they want on their land. And we have a real emphasis on soil health and conservation. So how can they incorporate some of those soil health principles into their land and wade through all the various things that go along with that?
And how does the program work? Is this spread out where you're doing it in your free time? Is it super intensive in the off season? Like how do you balance that?
So we offered this for the first time last year, and we're very open to continuing to adjust it so it's the most convenient for everyone. So for this year, what we're doing is we're having 5 in-person events. And those are happening in June and July. And then we're doing 2 online events. So that's kind of the major ask, is that we do want you to come to these in-person events. If they're in the Ames or the Ankeny area, and we have those dates in advance to make sure that you're available. Events are about 2 to 3 hours. But we think you know, being there in person, I know it's so much easier to do things virtually in a lot of ways, but like we think being there in person, going out, looking at fields that have reduced tillage, cover crops, perennials, and then having those conversations, meeting local conservation professionals, is really worth everyone's time, but it is a time commitment. And so, you know, it's not always the best fit for everyone. And one thing we've considered, you know, not in the next couple of years, but maybe sometime in the future, is doing a virtual one, especially for landowners who live out of state. And we've also talked about, like, so right now we're kind of focusing on the Ames, Ankeny area, but you know, in a couple of years, maybe we'll move closer to Iowa City, so it's convenient to those landowners. So this is our approach right now, but we're always tweaking it to make it a little bit better.
I was wondering about that since we have folks, we generate this show outside Des Moines, but we have people from all over the country who check this out. So I was curious if are there other programs similar to what you are doing elsewhere?
Gosh, that's a really good question. I'm sure that there are other programs through Extension or through other nonprofits that focus on landowners. I'm less familiar with ones outside of Iowa, but I know that there are ones that are not necessarily like this sort of intensive cohort model, but I know American Farmland Trust,
Hmm.
the Nature Conservancy, you know, a lot of these nonprofits do have landowner focused, and these are national organizations, so do have
Yeah.
like landowner focused work. A lot of land trusts, things like that as well. But yeah, I'm not familiar with another model like ours, which I think, you know, says that it's probably really needed to try it out and see if this makes a difference.
Yeah, I think we just committed you to having to figure out how to do this virtually too, right?
I know, I do. It is recorded, isn't it?
It is. Yeah, you're recorded now, so the pressure's there. Some of those things you were talking about earlier about how to have those conversations, especially if you are not doing everything on your own. Although, frankly, even if you're doing it on your own, you have to figure out what kind of commitment you're willing to make to do some of these things. So, how do you convey the importance of doing that?
Yeah. You know, I think when we started out working on some of these projects and some of this landowner focus, we thought, you know, we really need to deliver the science of like, this is how the practices work. These are why they are impactful. And I still think that's important. But what we've learned is that one of the things that landowners need the most help on is having that conversation, and having some tools to have that conversation with their tenant, with their co-owner about how to make these changes. So when we started out the program, we have everyone develop a goal. And so a lot of the goals that people came up with were like, I would like to convince my brother to try cover crops, or
Hmm.
I would like to have a conversation with my tenant. And so a lot of times I think too, there's an assumption, especially for landowners, if they don't have a background in farming, is that like it can be really uncomfortable to make a new recommendation to your tenant who's been farming all their life
Yeah.
and has a lot of knowledge. But we certainly see that a lot of tenants are nervous to start something new without the support of their landowner. And so it really works both ways. So more communication is always more important than less communication. And so just starting that conversation, we're not encouraging anyone to mandate anything or anything like that. But
Hmm.
like, if you have an interest in soil health, if you want to try reduced tillage on your land, express that to your tenant. Let them know that this is something you're interested in. Because they might be on the same page, but they were nervous about bringing it up to you. Because, you know, in our state, in Iowa, a lot of the power of the land is in the hand of the landowners.
Hmm.
And so, you know, taking on the responsibility of initiating that conversation, I do think is really important. And then, of course, the second part of that is helping them manage that risk. So, adopting a new conservation practice often comes with some sort of risk because it is a change. And so, you know, are you willing to help them look into financial incentives to make that change? Or are you willing to shift from cash rent to crop share? You know, whatever the approach is that works best for you all, you know, that's a long conversation to work out.
All right, I'm going to throw some politics in here, but I mean, for some of these things, there are some issues that feel up in the air right now
Mhm.
as as we're looking at what federal funding will continue, how much of it will continue on some of these things. We have a new administration in there that has different priorities than the previous one did. So how do you counsel people through this? Because I wish I had a little tally that would ding, ding, ding every time I've heard you say risk or manage risk or whatever, and uncertainty, trying something new, all that
Right.
stuff. But with some of this stuff, you are kind of taking a leap of faith and doing something differently. And if there are financial requirements, maybe you think there's a USDA program that's going to help you do it or whatever. I mean, there's kind of some uncertainty about whether we're talking to you in late March, and we are at a period right now where we've been talking to farmers who are wondering, okay, I went out on a limb and I just did this big $200,000, $300,000 project, whatever. I'm thinking I'm getting federal money in, and it's
Mhm.
frozen, and I don't know if I'm going to get it or not get it or whatever. So how do you help people through that uncertainty?
Yeah. Yeah, it is a really unusual time right now, and like heard many stories of, yeah, farmers who participated in a long-standing conservation program through the federal government, like the Environmental Quality Incentives Program, EQIP. And, you know, for a couple weeks, those payments were put on hold. And so a
Hmm.
lot of these are reimbursement programs. So someone
Yeah,
has already put in the money into doing this, and then they were told that they might not be reimbursed, which is a shock. And I do think does a lot of damage to the trust that people have historically had that, you know, the government's going to follow through and pay
yeah,
you. Um, those, as you know, like the freeze on those federal funds is done now. They are putting money, especially prioritizing money going directly to farmers. And I think part of that is because people said they didn't agree with this. We had a lot of farmers, a lot of conservation organizations say, like, this is really important. This is a contract between this individual and the
yeah.
government. You need to follow through on that. So I hope that's the end of that. But yeah, I mean, this has really thrown a wrench in things. I do think that some of the longstanding programs, we don't have any indication that those aren't going to be there. EQIP, you know, Conservation Stewardship Program.
Hmm.
We think these will continue. Those are farm bill funds. You know, in a lot of ways, they're already allocated, even though that's a struggle every time we get a new one.
Yeah. Or not
Um,
get a new one, as we've witnessed
yeah,
the last couple
right.
of years.
Yeah. But like the ones that you know do seem to be the most vulnerable one are ones that came through the Inflation Reduction
Hmm.
Act
Yeah.
and things like that. The climate smart emphasis, you know, that was a big emphasis of the last administration, and it's not an emphasis of this one. And so I know there's a lot of farmers who are interested in carbon markets
Hmm.
and 45Z, like being able to sell their products into new markets. And so yeah, those I don't know what that's going to look like, but like to your larger point about like um you know changing the system and risk, I think we don't always I think sometimes we lead with like, well, conservation is a shift and it's a risk, and I say those things too, but like there are so many decisions that are just sort of straightforward economic decisions too. Like one of the things that we talk about in our program is, a decent portion of Iowa's land that is in farming is unproductive, right?
Hmm.
They are putting more money into inputs, and this is for row crop acres, than they are for getting in revenue. And so that is an opportunity to take that land out of production, to put it in something different, to put it in perennials. That'll increase your income because we still have programs like the Conservation Reserve Program that pays to take that land out of production. So there are benefits there, but there are also benefits for, the market, right? Like we have this problem every year where, oops, we produce too much corn.
Yep.
And so the prices go down. The Conservation Reserve Program was developed to help us deal with taking care of the land, but a secondary and a major goal was to help support prices. And so if we can take land out of production that isn't productive and help control that supply of corn, then profits go up across the board. So there are examples like that where it is sort of a straightforward economic decision. Reducing the amount of tillage that you do, you might need to transition to doing, a different herbicide program, but you'll save on gas and things like that. So these aren't often like bad economic decisions, but often you have to think about it less in like, 1 year of economics and or your budget sheet, more like 3 years.
Hmm.
A lot of these really do pay off.
But as you know, that can be tough too if you're, especially in a year where your margins are so small, it's hard to, you're
Mhm.
almost in survival mode, and it's hard
Yes.
to think longer term.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I think that that long-term perspective is something that like is working against us in conservation. But there are lots of ways that landowners can help support the tenant thinking in terms of more than 1 year. And one way is to have a lease that is more than 1 year long. So you're deciding to support them, and they've got that stability for multiple years. This is something that particularly landowners who are interested in conservation um, are trying to make sure that they're supporting the tenant, helping that transition. But yeah, you're right. It is definitely there are lots of things pushing people to think annually.
We're, as we've mentioned, we're talking where we're both in Iowa, and a couple years back, this ended up being heading to the court system. But we dealt with like nitrate runoff in northern counties, gets into the water supply, comes down to Des Moines to the major facility there, and it was costing the Des Moines system a lot of money to clean all this stuff up, and and people got fired up in every different way around this. And it seemed to me like, it kind of brought into question at the end of the day, most people don't want mandates about stuff. Um, but big picture, we have to figure out we've got to what's best for the soil, what's best for the water,
Mm.
and whether it's little incremental things or bigger structural changes, like something's got to change, especially as every year we have numerous stories about, we have urban sprawl and everything else where, gobbling up the farmland. So we're not getting more of it, we're getting less of it
Right.
every year. So we're going to have to maximize what we have, but also protect what we have.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean that's where that long-term perspective is really helpful, is that, the soil is this base that everything rests upon. And if we don't take care of the soil, then we're going to be having very different conversations about what's possible in the Midwest. But yeah, your comment about nitrate too. I mean, um, we see the largest amount of nitrate, which is like the water soluble form of nitrogen, in our waterways in Iowa. usually in the spring, right? So late April, May, maybe into June. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that the majority of our land in Iowa is dedicated to corn and soybeans.
Hmm.
And those are summer annual crops. And so they're not actively growing in those spring, fall months. And so we really need something on the landscape to hold that nitrogen in place, because a lot of that nitrogen actually comes from the soil. It comes from our very rich, fertile soil. And so when we don't have living roots in the spring to help keep that nitrogen there, then we get issues with it running off. And so that's a bad thing, obviously, environmentally, but that's a bad thing economically too, because
Sure.
nitrogen is such an important thing for crop growth. And so you want to keep that on the landscape. And there's lots of research showing that if you take care of the soil, if you have good soil health, that that can make more nitrogen available to crops, or that can help crops use that nitrogen more efficiently. And so there's lots of reasons to think about making some long-term changes like cover crops, right? Those are something that if you add that to the landscape, it helps keep those living roots and helps keep the nitrogen, keep the carbon too. I mean, one of the biggest benefits of cover crops is that they decrease erosion, right? And so that is the base of agriculture, running off the landscape. And so we want to keep that in place so that this can continue to be a productive area for farmland for generations.
One thing that I didn't bring up with the landowner education program is that for this year, again, this is free. No cost to those who join. How does that happen?
Sure. Well, as you know, nothing is truly free. So how it works is that we wrote a grant to get this project funded for 3 years. And so because of that grant, we're able to, and the funding for that is secure. So we're good. We've got the money in hand. But so we're able to offer this for free for 3 years. And so this year and next year will be the last free years, and then we
Okay.
will start charging.
Okay.
But yeah, this is kind of an unusual situation. We also are giving folks this year and next year a $75 education credit to use at any Iowa State event. So we've got lots of perks for the next couple of years for people to sign up and take advantage.
And clearly, because of this podcast, you've committed to coming up with some incredibly national virtual explosion new program that you're going to launch
Uh-huh.
here too. So we'll expect to hear news about that.
Oh, sure. Yeah. And I hope some large corporate sponsors are also watching who
Yeah,
want to help fund this.
for sure. So, how do you see? How should conversations go forward? I mentioned earlier that it feels like, in a lot of ways, our solutions are likely going to have to be voluntary when we're looking at soil health and the future of agriculture and all of that. So, how do you prioritize that to make that at the forefront, and that for more people to commit to that? Because, as you know, there are some people who believe that mandates are the only way you're going to get some people to take part in it, and it forces you to rethink things. And we've already mentioned 100 times here during this conversation about change is difficult, and you got to, kind of lay everything out. So how do you make it top of mind for folks so that this structural change happens?
Yeah. I mean, so I think one thing is that I think it I think it really is top of mind already for a lot of folks. In agriculture, we always try to emphasize the economics, and that makes sense. But I think there are already lots of people who are strongly motivated by taking care of the soil, taking care of the land, taking care of habitat so that we have good, hunting opportunities in our state, things like that. And so I actually think it's reframing. So, some of our recommendations around conservation have changed in the last couple of decades, right? Like 100 years ago, we thought that tillage was awesome for the
Yeah.
soil. Like you couldn't till it enough, and that's how you have a productive system. Now we know that you can have a very productive system without tilling at all. And
Hmm.
so I think part of it is just reframing it to fit into the beliefs that they already have. Something like cover crops. Iowa used to grow a lot more small grains, which are essentially, the cover crops that we might use today. And so that knowledge is already there. That understanding about these different systems is already there, but it's kind of shifting the conversation um, uh, to the different issues that we're dealing with now. And a great example is nitrate. So historically, a lot of our messages in conservation have been around soil erosion, which is really important, and we still have work to do there. But now we're talking about nitrate, and that is something that you can't see. It's harder to understand. And so something like reduced tillage is an amazing practice. It really helps us with soil erosion. It does absolutely nothing for nitrate reduction. And so helping people understand that like reduced tillage is really important, but if you grow row crops in Iowa, in the Midwest, we need every single person who grows row crops to use cover crops. That's a huge, huge shift for people. So that's one component of it. I think another way that we really emphasize this with landowners is just through people. So this is another thing that's a little up in the air right now, but so far we still have lots of conservation professionals on the landscape. People who work for the NRCS, but also people who work for the Iowa Department of Agriculture, nonprofits. We have a huge conservation workforce in our state. And so there are people locally who can help you adopt these practices and who are living in your local communities. And so just being able to find that person, I think, is also really hard because, they might exist on a website, but finding them locally might be another thing. And so just getting connected to that person locally, I think, is another way to keep that front of mind, and also to make sure that you have someone who's supporting you as you start kind of this journey.
See, this is way more interesting than being an international spy, right?
I don't know if I agree with you, but I do think this is interesting.
Catherine, we appreciate it. Thank you so much for the time.
Yeah, thank you, Dave. Nice talking with you.
Too. You can find out why Catherine DeLong is so passionate about the landowner education program. Check out our profile piece about her. It's part of our weekly American Farmland Owner newsletter. The newsletter has the latest research, trends, challenges, and important news for farmland owners, investors, and the ag curious. Check it out at AmericanFarmlandOwner.com. Thanks for listening to the podcast, and thanks for caring about the future of our farmland.